जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। देखूं तुझको नील नभ में, देखूं तुझको जमुना जल में। शाम ढलते आना शाम, शाम ढलते आना शाम। मैं चलूंगी तेरे साथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। कुंजवन सजा है आज, तड़ित संग मेघराज। कुंजवन सजा है आज, तड़ित संग मेघराज। मेरा विफल जन्म जो मैं आज, विफल जन्म जो मैं आज। कह न पाई दिल की बात। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। कुंजन में मधुर गान, श्याम चरण सौंपूंगी प्राण। कुंजन में मधुर गान, श्याम चरण सौंपूंगी प्राण। कहेगी रजनी हो विभोर, कहेगी रजनी हो विभोर। तुम देर से आओ प्रभात, तुम देर से आओ प्रभात। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ परमनाथ हे गोविंद थामो हाथ। जगन्नाथ।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. You just heard a devotional song in the voice that you are very familiar with now, Mithu's voice, as sweet as her name itself indicates. This was, as happens in many devotional songs, underestimating the powers and the love of the divine, because we tend to look upon the divine sometimes as only a magnified version of ourselves. So the devotee with great hesitation was making this little small request, just keep holding my hand, or rather hold my hand. The divine does much more than that on its own. We just have to be conscious of it and receptive to it. That reminds me of a little story which you might have heard of a person finding that, as he was walking, the divine was holding his hand and walking with him. And so he could see two sets of footprints on the ground. And then suddenly one set of footprints disappeared. And he thought the Lord had abandoned him. But then the Lord revealed to him that he had not been abandoned. In fact, now there was just one set of footprints left, because the Lord was carrying him in his lap. Today's session is about fats. The talk is as densely packed as the fats are. and I hope I'll be able to sustain your attention throughout. Why we call fats densely packed is because they provide far more energy per gram than carbohydrates and proteins. So with that little introduction, let's go to the PowerPoint. PowerPoint will also succeed in making a few powerful points. Before we start, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. The YES program is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebrations of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Among the traditional nutrients, today we'll discuss the fats. And the fats illustrate beautifully this quote from Emerson: everyone is needed, nobody is needed much. We do need fats, but not much of them. The energy content of the fats is 9 calories per gram, in contrast with carbohydrates and proteins, which provide 4 calories per gram. So more than double for the same weight. The next question that arises is, how much of fats do we need? In fact, very little. Even if we add no oil or butter or ghee to our diet, still we will not suffer from fat deficiency, because there's something called invisible fat. Fat that we don't see, and still it is there in the diet, because all our cereals and pulses and vegetables, particularly green leafy vegetables, they have very small amounts of fat, and this minute quantity of fat is quite enough to meet our fat requirements, particularly the requirement of what are called the essential fatty acids. So like essential amino acids, there are also 2 essential fatty acids, and the requirement of both these can be met by this invisible fat. And that's what makes it possible to survive and thrive even on a zero fat diet. And in fact, zero oil cooking or zero fat cooking is one of the fads which is one of the popular is getting popular. So it is possible. It's possible to stay healthy on that type of a diet, although it's not essential to go completely free of visible fat. Now, combining this invisible fat and visible fat, how much of the energy intake should fats give? The estimates have been varying, but the general consensus is up to 30% of the energy intake. Now here you will see that the total energy that we take has to come from these 3 sources. These are the energy-giving nutrients: fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. By and large, as far as possible, we should try to keep the protein energy constant at about 10%. We may be able to survive on a little less, but some people may need a little more, particularly during certain states like pregnancy or recovering from an illness. So 10% is a reasonable amount to aim at. Maybe a little higher will not do any harm, but much more can do harm, as we saw in the previous class. So kept it at 10%. Now, so the remaining has to be distributed between fats and carbohydrates, and we have there quite a bit of leeway or elasticity available. Now, in the fats, what I've assumed here is that 5% of the energy intake is coming from invisible fat. So if another 10% of the energy intake comes from visible fat, that will leave 75% of the energy to come from carbohydrates, and so on. So as we go on increasing the amount of visible fat, the percentage of energy coming from carbohydrates will go on decreasing. And if we go up to the usually accepted upper limit of about 30% of the energy coming from fats, we'll be taking about 60% of our energy intake from carbohydrates. And this, as you can see, is a fairly reasonable type of an estimate, keeping in mind that cereals and pulses have 60 to 70% carbohydrate. And therefore, this works out quite well with the usual traditional Indian diet. So how much of visible fat? The less the better, but we don't have to go in for extremes of zero oil cooking. We can take a reasonable amount of fat. The body has enough resilience to be able to do pretty well and stay completely healthy on a fat intake, some visible fat intake. And that is important because much of Indian cooking does require, in fact, some visible fat. Much of the debate is not so much about how much of fat to take, but about which particular fat. And that is because, like carbohydrates and okay, before we go to which one, there's a little more on how much of visible fat. The less, the better. But then still there should be some guidelines. And here is a little calculation. Suppose we decide that we'll take 15% of the energy intake from visible fat. 5% from invisible, 15% from visible. So total, the carbohydrates are contributing 20% to the energy intake, which is very reasonable and totally acceptable. Now, suppose the person's daily energy intake is 2000 calories. So 15% of that will be 300 calories, and these calories can come from fat, visible fat. Now, these 300 calories will come from how many grams of fat? 9 calories per gram. So these 300 calories will come from 33 grams of fat. 33 grams of fat per day translates into 990 grams of fat per month, which means about a kilo per month. So a family of 5 may consume 1 5-kilo container of a visible fat per month. But however, many nutritionists in fact recommend not 1 kilo per month, but half a kilo per person per month. And why do they do that? They do that because the person may not be actually consuming 2000 calories per day. And most Indians, unless those who are engaged in heavy work, do consume less rather than more than 2000 calories. 1500 to 2000 calories is quite normal and quite adequate. So if the energy intake is less than 2000 calories per day, then naturally the percentage, if is remaining the same, the number of calories which fat should contribute will become less, and correspondingly, then the calculation will not lead us to 1 kilo per month, but less than 1 kilo per month. Secondly, the calculations which we did for visible fat do not take into account that the person may be consuming some snacks every day, snacks purchased from the market, like potato chips, etc. It did not take into account any nuts that the person may be consuming, and nuts also provide a considerable amount of fat. It also did not take into account what the person may eat at a party, eating out in a restaurant, or when the person orders food like a hamburger or a pizza for home delivery. It didn't take into account that. And it also didn't take into account the additional fat that the person might have on festive occasions. And therefore, most nutritionists, or many nutritionists, feel that it's safer to just recommend half a kilo per month. So a family of 5 should be consuming not 1 container per month, but 1 5-kilo container in 2 months. Safer and also saves money. Now, we have seen in considerable detail now how much of visible fat we may consume. But much of the debate is about which fat it should be, and that's what we shall see now. Should it be sunflower oil? Should it be ghee and butter, or should it be olive oil, and so on? These are the type of questions that puzzle us. And that is based on the fact that, like carbohydrates and proteins, all fats are also not alike. And how they are different? To understand that, as in the case of proteins, we'll need to go a bit into the chemistry of fats. And once again, I'll try to simplify it as much as I can. But if you don't understand, again, as in the case of proteins, you'll not lose much. You can feel happy that I failed in making it sufficiently simple. Now, all the fat that we take in our diet is in the form of what are called triglycerides. And a triglyceride is made up of the glycerol molecule. No, molecule in chemistry means the smallest entity that still has the properties of that substance. So on the left-hand side, you have the glycerol molecule. On the right-hand side, you have a triglyceride molecule. These are both molecules, because if you break it any further, glycerol will no longer remain glycerol, or if you break this triglyceride, it will no longer remain triglyceride, it will become something else. Now, glycerol molecule forms the backbone of the triglyceride molecule. And attached to this glycerol through chemical bonding are three of these long chain fatty acids. Long chain, because most of the dietary triglycerides have about 15 to 20 carbon atoms in a chain. So that's why we call them long chain fatty acids. So there are three of them attached. And when we call a fat saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated, that depends upon the predominant type of fatty acids present in that fat. So the basic structure remaining the same, that of a triglyceride, that is the glycerol serving as the backbone, and attached to it, there being three different or the same or different, three molecules of fatty acids. Then the predominant type of fatty acids that are attached to the glycerol molecule decide what type of fat it will be, saturated or unsaturated. Now, how do saturated and unsaturated fatty acids differ from each other? Because you see, the difference is not in the glycerol molecule, the difference is in the fatty acids attached to it. So we have these three different types of fatty acids, and accordingly, the fat is labeled as saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated. A saturated fatty acid is a stable molecule. It is fully satisfied. You can call it a contented or satisfied molecule. It is not therefore very reactive. It is quite, you'll have to work hard to make it, to break it or to change it to something else. It's contented as it is. The monounsaturated fatty acids, on the other hand, have at one point in the molecule what is called a vacancy. Vacancy means that somehow the molecule has been made, but it can take on something else. So provided there is something suitable available in the environment, like say oxygen, it may react with it, become a little different type of molecule, and that is what means, that it is not fully contented. It has a certain amount of discontent. Then the polyunsaturated fatty acids, in each molecule, there is not just one. Mono means one. So that's why monounsaturated fatty acid. Poly means many. So in polyunsaturated fatty acids, there are more than one such vacancy. So they are like highly eligible bachelors, very hungry at the peak of puberty. That is the type of fats polyunsaturated fatty acids are. And therefore, the moment something becomes available, they grab it. And that is high. That is what explains to some extent one of the properties of these fatty acids, their shelf life. Saturated fats have a long shelf life. Polyunsaturated fats have a short shelf life. And but then the good Lord has ensured that when a fatty acid is highly unsaturated, polyunsaturated, that type of a natural oil, which is highly unsaturated, also has in it considerable amounts of vitamin E. The amount of vitamin E is related to the degree of unsaturation. And vitamin E prevents this type of spoilage or going bad. But all the same, the shelf life of unsaturated fats is shorter than that of saturated fats. Of course, there are other differences. Saturated fats tend to be solid in winters. They melt a little only in, solid in winters. They melt a little in summers, whereas unsaturated fats are liquid throughout the year. And saturated fats are by and large animal fats. The exception to this is coconut oil, to some extent also palm oil. These are vegetable oils, but they do have saturated fat. On the other hand, polyunsaturated fatty acids are found in plant fats, fats of plant origin, that is oils. The exception here is fish oils, which are animal fats but are unsaturated. They have polyunsaturated fat. Now, why do fish have these polyunsaturated fats, whereas so many other animals have mainly saturated fat? Easy to rationalize, because the fish live in cold water, and if the fat in their body solidifies in that cold water, it will serve no biological purpose. It may in fact end up being a source of many problems. And therefore, they need to have fat which will remain liquid even at low temperatures inside the water. And that also explains one more thing, why if you take out fish and keep it for some time, it goes stale very quickly, because polyunsaturated fat has a shorter shelf life. So this explains some of, so if you keep these things in mind, it's easy to sort out in your mind which fats are likely to be saturated and which are monounsaturated. And correspondingly, among vegetable oils, the exception is coconut oil, and coconut oil does solidify in winters. It's liquid only in summers. And what about monounsaturated fats? The prototype, which is extremely rich in monounsaturated fat, is olive oil. But then there are many other oils which also have oils and fats, including ghee. Ghee also is 65% saturated, 35% monounsaturated. But the cooking medium, which has the largest amount of monounsaturated fat, is olive oil. Now, why is it important to understand these differences between different types of fatty acids and correspondingly the different types of fats? Because it is the type of fatty acid, the predominant type of fatty acid, that determines what we will call that fat, or what that fat is, whether it is saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated. So far as giving energy is concerned, it doesn't matter which fatty acid gives us energy. We can get it from all varieties of fatty acids. So there it really doesn't matter. And you might say that, do we use fats for getting energy? Yes, we do. In fact, we keep shifting from predominantly glucose consumption to a considerable amount of fat consumption, and depending upon when we had the meal. So soon after a meal, we consume primarily glucose, but between meals, say 3 to 4 hours after a meal, we are consuming considerable amounts of fat, except in organs which cannot consume fat, like brain. The brain consumes only glucose. It doesn't live on fat. So we consume a considerable amount of fat. So this shift keeps taking place several times a day, from predominantly carbohydrate to a considerable amount of fat for getting energy. So this comes from fat, which you may say is available to us as in a savings bank account. So you keep putting in, drawing, keep putting in, keep drawing it when you need it. In addition, of course, we have fat stored as a fixed deposit. That is what creates problems. That's what makes us overweight. Some amount is necessary. It helps us during lean periods, and it has many other functions also apart from that. But too much of it can create problems. So that is like a fixed deposit. We'll draw upon it only during starvation. So then we'll get energy predominantly from fat, because we are not eating anything else during starvation. But anyway, so fat does give us energy, and there it doesn't matter which fatty acid it is, saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated. However, fat has other functions. And one of them is, it is a part of cell membranes. Our body is made up of trillions of cells. And in all these cells, they have a thin membrane around them, which demarcates the cell. And in this cell membrane, we have proteins and fats. And these fats form a part of these cell membranes and determine to quite an extent the health of the cells, or how healthy these cells are. And here, unlike in case of proteins, where the body is very fussy about which amino acid it will use, if you don't have the right one available, the protein chain doesn't prolong any further. It stops there till the amino acid becomes available. In case of utilizing fats for manufacturing cell membranes, or constructing cell membranes, the body is not fussy. It just uses the type of fatty acid that happens to be available. So if we have more saturated fat in the diet, it will use more saturated fat for cell membranes. If we have more unsaturated fat, it will use unsaturated fat. But then it does affect the type of cell membranes which we will get. Saturated fat gives us what may be called solid or strong cell membranes. Saturated fat has the solidity, it is stable. Whereas if unsaturated fat gets incorporated in these membranes, it increases what is called loosely the fluidity of the membrane. Increase in the fluidity of the membrane means that it is now more permeable. Permeable means it will let harmful substances enter the cell easily. And if these harmful substances keep entering the cell easily, the cell is likely to get damaged. And that is what may explain what happens if we consume too much of unsaturated fat, when saturated fat is in short supply in the body, because the body will use whatever happens to be available. And here is the structure of the cell membrane. to sort of further strengthen this point. As you can see, the cell membrane has as its core a lipid bilayer, which means this is one fat molecule and this is another one. And it's arranged in such a way that you have the hydrophilic group. Hydrophilic means that one which hates water on the outside, and the which loves water. Hydrophilic is what loves water, and hydrophobic is what hates water. And so in the outer one is the one which can mix easily with water. Inside is what will not easily mix with water. And you've seen that because of this, fats start floating in the water because of this hydrophobic character. But same time, if you want to make an emulsion, you can make an emulsion because it does have a hydrophilic group also. It's easy to remember. Hydrophilic, phile refers to love. Philosophy, lover of wisdom. Bibliophile, a lover of books. So hydrophilic, a lover of water. Phobic, all types of phobia, as you know, being afraid of this thing, that thing is a phobia. So it's afraid of water. So that's how we get it. So this is a lipid bilayer. But along with that, we have proteins. Proteins of various types. Some proteins which traverse through and through the membrane, and some proteins which are just on the surface. And we also have some carbohydrate in the cell membrane sticking out here. So that is roughly the structure of a cell membrane, and you can see how much lipid goes into the manufacturing of these cell membranes. And the type of fatty acids that are used here will depend upon the type of fat that is available in our diet, and that changes the properties of the membrane. If saturated fat gives it a certain strength and stability, whereas unsaturated fat makes it weaker and more permeable. Now, within unsaturated fat, again, you might have heard of N3 and N6, or omega-3 and omega-6 type of polyunsaturated fats. And what is the difference? The difference is that the first poly means that they will have more than one vacancies, what I call technically double bonds. So a polyunsaturated fat will have in its molecule more than one. So I've shown 3 here and 3 here. But then this N3 or N6 depends upon where the first double bond or the first vacancy is, counting from a particular end of the fatty acid. So counting from this end, the first vacancy is at position 3, and in case the distance is double, so it is at position 6. So if the first double bond or the first vacancy is at position 3, counting from this end, then it is at N3. And if it is at position 6, counting from this end, then it is N6, irrespective of where the other double bonds are or the other vacancies are. So this is the difference between N3 and N6. Why this is important, we'll see in the next picture, because fats get incorporated not only in cell membranes, fats also get converted in the body into metabolically active substances. I'll not go into the names because that will be more like showing off rather than have any practical, but it gets converted into useful metabolically active substances. And there also it does matter which fatty acids are available in the diet, because once again, the body is not fussy about which fatty acid is used. And there N3 and N6 become very important, because if we have more of N3 available, then we'll get metabolically active substances which will use N3. And if we have more N6, then similar molecules will be produced. Similar metabolically active molecules will be made by using N6. And what difference does it make? If we use N3, then we get the type of molecules which prevent heart disease and cancer, to put it sort of in the terms of the end result. And if we have more of N6 manufacturing these metabolically active substances, then we in fact increase the risk for heart disease and cancer. So that is what N3 versus N6 means. And that is why all the recent talk about N3 or omega-3 fats. So this is the difference between the two and why that is important. Okay. Now, let's see how the trends regarding this, all that we have heard so far, have been changing. The traditional diets, at least in the Indian diets, always had a variety of fats. Quite a bit of our cooking was done in vegetable oils, a variety of cooking oils like mustard oil or coconut oil. And then we also used considerable amounts of ghee and butter. And the result was that the diet had a reasonable mixture of saturated fats, monounsaturated fat, N3 polyunsaturated fat, and N6 polyunsaturated fat. And the N6 to N3 ratio was about 1:1. Then came a change, starting with some studies by Ansel Keys in the 1950s, which were based on this sort of a logic that a certain set of people who were more likely to get heart disease had high blood cholesterol levels. Research showed that saturated fat increases blood cholesterol levels. Polyunsaturated fat brings down blood cholesterol levels. From that, it was extrapolated that bringing down blood cholesterol levels is desirable because that will probably decrease the risk for heart disease. Unsaturated fats were present in oils like sunflower oil, sesame oil, corn oil, and so on. So these oils were promoted as healthy oils. On the other hand, saturated fat increases blood cholesterol levels, and therefore people were discouraged from taking any saturated fat like butter or ghee. And there came a point when people started consuming as visible fat almost exclusively under medical advice oils like sunflower oil and sesame oil and corn oil. Sesame, til ka tel, and corn oil. People started consuming these almost exclusively. Now, these are oils which are highly unsaturated, and much of this unsaturated fat is polyunsaturated fat, and this polyunsaturated fat is N6. Now, if N6 goes up so much, without doing anything to the N3 content, the N6-N3 ratio went up to 30:1, which is such a contrast with 1:1. And then it was noticed that while it might have brought down blood cholesterol levels, the heart disease didn't come down. In fact, it seemed to go up. And along with that, the risk for cancer, etc., also went up. So it created problems. In fact, much can be said for the resilience of the body that it tolerated this type of a drastic change from a traditional diet with a variety of fatty acids to one which had almost exclusively N6, and one in which the ratio of N6 to N3 shifted from 1:1 to up to 30:1. So the body is wonderfully made. It tolerated this without any very obvious damage, and therefore it could go on for more than 30 years before we could observe that there might be possibly something wrong with this type of a change. But then in the meantime, what has happened is that while this knowledge came about 30 years ago, that this shift from the traditional diets to this, which was logical but not safe, logic based on a certain set of studies, but it was not the safest and the best thing to do. While this knowledge is about 30 years old, I think for this to be translated into medical advice from nutritionists, and to translate into public advice takes time. And the result is that many people still continue to be under the impression that these are the most healthy oils. And of course, the industry again contributes to it because a lot of industry built around these oils, and they continue to promote it. Not only they continue to promote, they take account of recent knowledge and then try to use it, twist it to sell the same oil by blending it with some oil which might have some N3. So they may blend sunflower oil with soybean oil and say that, well, soybean oil provides you N3, so our blend has N3. But then they don't say what is the sense in diluting sunflower oil, which is almost exclusively N6, with a bit of soybean oil and reaching a ratio, maybe instead of 30:1, reaching a ratio of 20:1. Why not go to soybean oil itself, which has a ratio of about 8:1? Why not go to soybean oil itself? What additional advantage are we getting by diluting that soybean oil with sunflower oil? That they don't tell you. That is because a lot of industry is built around sunflower oil. So that is why this advice continues to persist. So this is what happened during this period of about 30 years. Sunflower oil and other similar highly unsaturated oils, which are almost exclusively N6 UFA, and which took our N6-N3 ratio in the diet to 30:1. It had effects which we started noticing after the 1990s, And some of these effects were that while blood cholesterol levels came down, heart disease didn't necessarily come down because the metabolites that were produced by large amounts of N6, which the body was using for preparing metabolically active substances instead of N3, had an effect of increasing the aggregation of platelets. Aggregation means clumping together. So that was leading to formation of these clots in the blood, which will increase the risk for both heart disease and stroke. And some of the metabolites which excess N6 were producing were pro-inflammatory in nature, which means they were leading to inflammation of the blood vessel walls of the blood vessels and many other places. And chronic subclinical inflammation of this type has now been shown to be an important contributor to diseases like heart disease and diabetes. So it's not just a disease of the pancreatic cells or a disease of the arterial wall, cells in the arterial wall. In these places, the blood vessels, because of this chronic inflammation, are more likely to get damaged, more likely to let harmful substances into the cell because of the damaged cell walls, fluid cell walls. And the result is that these are the vessels which are more likely to also get clogged. So while the blood cholesterol levels came down, because our aim is not to bring down blood cholesterol level, our aim is to prevent heart disease. There is a certain association between high blood cholesterol and heart disease, but that doesn't mean that bringing it down as much as possible is the best thing to do. And by using this type of lopsided diets, that is not the best thing to do. So that is what we realized after the 1990s. So while blood cholesterol levels came down, heart disease did not. And there were reduced immunity levels, which increased, among other things, also the possibility of cancer. Because cancer is also related closely to immunity. The fact that most of us get small little growths in the body from time to time and don't even come to know about them. We remain blissfully unaware of those little tumors developing here and there in the bodies because the immune system of the body takes care of them. The immune system treats these cancer cells or tumor cells also as foreign, and immune system basically acts as something which comes from outside the body, which doesn't belong to the body. So the body treats these early tumors, very minute tumors, small tumors, also as something which doesn't belong to the body. So it's the immune system that destroys these tumors and we remain blissfully unaware of them. But the immunity is weak, the body may not be able to do it, and that's how these little tumors which keep coming up from time to time get a chance to grow into full-fledged tumors, and that is what cancer is about. So that is how the risk for heart disease and cancer went up as a result of these lopsided diets. So then what is the current recommendation, the scientific medical recommendation post 1990? We should take a variety of fats. Don't take just corn oil or sunflower oil. Okay, that is what the traditional diet also was. And then there are many sort of ways to input, but one of the most recent references, 2021, gives a range of how much saturated, how much monounsaturated, and how much polyunsaturated one should have. And at the cost of some simplification, one can say about 1/3 of the fat should be saturated, 1/3 monounsaturated, 1/3 polyunsaturated. That is what traditional diets also were. They were a mixture of all these. And then N6 to N3, in the traditional diets, it was around 1:1. Now they say at least it should not exceed 5:1. Less the better. 1:1 is better than 5:1, but maybe it can go up to 5:1. And don't take it to 20:1 or 30:1, the way it was happening with those exclusively N6 type of fats. So the language is different, but as you can see, the post-1990 recommendations are hardly different from our traditional diets. It's just that the language has become more scientific, which means that now there is greater scientific support for traditional diets, which means the traditional diets are now on a very sound scientific footing. What is new in the market? Blends. As I talked a short while back, dilute oils like sunflower oil with soybean oil, which has N3. Canola oil. Mustard oil is a good oil. It has a mixture of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated, and perhaps among the cooking oils, the highest amount of N3 type of polyunsaturated fat. So mustard oil is good, but mustard oil doesn't smell too good. So what they did in Canada was to breed two different plants of the same family, Brassica family, mustard, cabbage, and all these belong to the Brassica family. They interbred two species of this Brassica family and created a plant which had seeds, which had oil, but did not have that type of a smell. And it did not have one of those components, which is called erucic acid, which is there in small amounts in mustard oil. Now, erucic acid is one of those things which illustrates, that Hindi saying, "Bad acha badnaam bura," which means it's being bad is not as bad as being notorious. Being notorious is much worse than actually being bad. Now, what is wrong with erucic acid? What is wrong is that some animal studies have shown that erucic acid can lead to accumulation of fat in the heart cells, and that can create problems with the heart. It can lead to a certain type of heart disease. And therefore, it may be doing something similar in human beings. But then these studies have been extrapolated to the extent possible. And it has also been said that up to 5% of erucic acid may be quite acceptable. And this erucic acid present in mustard oil, as well as its close cousin, rapeseed oil, which is called safed sarson or toria. Toria ka tel, safed sarson ka tel, all these have a certain amount of erucic acid, but less than 5% is considered acceptable. Canola oil has no erucic acid or very little erucic acid. So that is and why it is called canola? Because it was developed in Canada. So CAN stands for Canada. So this is something new that has happened, which tries to sort of make it easier to implement the new knowledge, in which you take oils similar to mustard oil, which have a good supply of N3 type of fat, polyunsaturated fat. Rice bran oil. Now, rice bran oil does not have N3 type of fatty acids. Its main strength is that it does have some monounsaturated fat, so it's not exclusively polyunsaturated fat like corn oil and sunflower oil. And another thing that has been given undue importance rice bran oil is the presence of a substance called oranzol, which can bring down blood cholesterol levels. But why that little bit of oranzol in rice bran oil may not count for much, we shall see in a moment, because the blood cholesterol level is affected by a very large number of factors. So a little less oranzol or little extra oranzol will hardly make any difference to how our blood cholesterol behaves in response to our diet. Third, another new thing that has come up is no trans fats. Now, this is important because when at a certain stage, it was found that you can bubble hydrogen through unsaturated fat, that is vegetable oils like groundnut oil. And the result is that the fat solidifies and starts looking and behaving like ghee and butter. If you bubble it to take it only up to the semi-solid sort of state, it will start looking like butter, and that is what margarine is. Or if you bubble more, then it solidifies like ghee. And the result of this conversion of unsaturated fat into saturated fat, bubbling hydrogen, because unsaturated means it has vacancies. So it grabs that hydrogen and becomes saturated. And therefore it acquires the properties of saturated fats, it becomes solid. It also has a longer shelf life. But then all the saturated fat formed in this way by bubbling hydrogen is not like the natural saturated fat found in, say, butter or ghee. This has a considerable amount of another type of saturated fat, which is called trans fats, and this has been found to increase the risk for heart disease and cancer. So one of the things which has now taken off is no trans fats in your diet. And the result is that hardly anybody uses hydrogenated vegetable oils for cooking now. This has caught on. However, in industry, the hydrogenated oils continue to be used to some extent for making biscuits and snacks, and that is because of its longer shelf life and it's being much less expensive than ghee. So many of the snacks sold in the market still have trans fat because hydrogenated fats continue to be used, and the label might only say among the ingredients, edible vegetable fat, because hydrogenated fat is also edible. It's not totally inedible. Therefore, you have to be careful if it says that. However, some snacks now have started coming and pretty popular again, which declare in very bold letters, no trans fat. How do they achieve that and combine it with a longer shelf life? what they are doing is they are using a blend of vegetable oils, which includes oils like palm oil, which have a considerable amount of saturated fat. And this blend, because of the saturated fat content of oils like palm oil, then comes to have a longer shelf life. So this is how they are achieving both ends, no trans fat and at the same time, longer shelf life. So if you have to go in for these biscuits and snacks, try and get those which say no trans fat. So which are the recommended fats, keeping in view this knowledge, new knowledge? The oils to be recommended are mustard oil or canola oil or soybean oil. And along with that, use a moderate amount of ghee or butter. That would be sort of the sum and substance of all that we have talked so far. And you might have guessed why we are making that recommendation. Mustard oil for getting N3 polyunsaturated fat. Instead of mustard oil, we may use canola oil, which will provide the same. Instead of canola oil, we may use soybean oil, which will also provide the same, although not as much as mustard oil or canola oil. And why ghee or butter? For saturated and monounsaturated fat. Ghee and butter are about 65% saturated, 35% monounsaturated. Why this is important to emphasize is because people think ghee is all saturated fat and therefore bad for the heart. But it also has monounsaturated fat, and replacing saturated fat with monounsaturated fat itself has been shown to be very beneficial in keeping cholesterol levels in good shape. And instead of trying to get that monounsaturated fat from olive oil, why not get it from ghee or butter, which are more traditional and which give us a more balanced intake if we combine it with one of these oils. So among the popular cooking mediums in India, mustard oil and soybean oils are the only ones that have N3 polyunsaturated fat. Mustard oil, of course, includes its close cousins like rapeseed oil and canola oil. These are the only ones, because people still have a tendency to ask, how about rice bran oil? How about flaxseed oil? How about this oil? How about that oil? Among the popular cooking mediums, these are the only two. Of course, mustard oil includes its close cousins, which have N3 PUFA. Now let's look at a few other oils in background of this knowledge. Coconut oil is primarily saturated fat, but then this fat is not long chain, but it has medium chain fatty acids. So these are medium chain triglycerides. The difference that it makes is twofold. One is that it is easy to digest. And therefore, people who have a digestive problem will still be able to digest coconut oil quite well. They may not tolerate other fats, but this they will be able to digest more easily. And that is why it is also given when a person is recovering, say, from diarrhea. The person will tolerate coconut oil much better than other fats. But then it is a staple oil in Kerala in India, in Sri Lanka. How about those populations? Do they have more heart disease because of the saturated fat? Studies have shown that they do not have excess heart disease attributable to coconut oil. This may be because medium chain triglycerides do not increase the risk, and it may also be partly because over generations, these populations have got accustomed to coconut. So those who are accustomed to coconut oil can continue taking it without fear of heart disease. Rice bran oil, it's basically an N6 type of polyunsaturated fat, but it also has a considerable amount of monounsaturated fat, and that is what has been capitalized on, apart from oranzol, as I said some time back. Then palm oil, basically a mixture of saturated and monounsaturated fat, and that is why it has a long shelf life. And unrefined palm oil also is red in color because of carotene, which is vitamin A. Say rapeseed oil, similar to mustard oil, saturated, monounsaturated, N3 PUFA and N6 PUFA. N3 is the main thing to keep in mind because there are very few sources. Canola oil, the same thing. Soybean oil, similar. Groundnut oil, saturated fat, monounsaturated fat. Well, polyunsaturated is all N6, no N3. It's a moderate oil compared to corn oil. It's a mixture of all three, but no N3 once again. Hydrogenated oils, you can say, have artificial saturated fat, and along with that, some trans fat. So not desirable. Margarine, again, like hydrogenated oils, therefore it has trans fat, although the hydrogenation has been stopped at a point where it will still be not as solid as hydrogenated oils. Olive oil, basically monounsaturated fat, somewhat difficult to use in Indian cooking, particularly because of its low smoking point, which means you can't take it to a very high temperature. Although some versions of olive oil are now available, which can be heated. But then as you can see, again, no N3, no saturated fat, and there is really, therefore, not much to speak for this highly prestigious oil, olive oil, and certainly one can easily dispense with it without any harm to one's health. Flaxseed oil, it is not a cooking medium. It's only a food supplement. It can be used as a food supplement providing N3 PUFA. The quantity per day should be less than 15 grams per day. More than that can be harmful. And it also has toxic interactions with many drugs commonly used, such as painkillers, lipid-lowering drugs, drugs used for high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes. So please do consult your doctor before you take flaxseed oil, and that too in small amounts, only as a supplement. You can't use it as a cooking medium. Flaxseed, ilsi kate. Fish oil, again something similar. It is again not a cooking medium. It is a supplement which provides N3 PUFA. We also have considerable amounts of vitamin A and D, which is good. But then again, 1 gram of fish oil is equivalent to about 7 grams of flaxseed oils, which means flaxseed oil is less than 15 grams a day. Fish oil should be less than 2 grams a day. And the same precautions about drug interactions apply also to fish oil. So instead of using flaxseed oil and fish oil as sources of N3 PUFA, probably it may be much more convenient and sensible to use a cooking medium which itself will provide N3 PUFA, like corn oil, canola oil, or soybean oil. Now we come to the much maligned cholesterol. Cholesterol is a close cousin of fats. It is found in many foods which have fat, and high levels of cholesterol in the blood are associated with heart disease. However, why I said much maligned is because all the loss in reputation that it has suffered may not be really deserved by cholesterol, because cholesterol is not a poison. Cholesterol is a part of our diet. Cholesterol is needed by the body. If it will not take any cholesterol in the diet, the body will manufacture cholesterol for the purposes for which it needs it. Second important thing which is often confused is dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol. We may or may not take cholesterol in our diet, but the blood cholesterol will never come down to zero, because cholesterol is a normal constituent of the body and therefore also a normal constituent of the circulating blood. If we take no cholesterol at all in the diet, there'll be no harm, because the body will manufacture all the cholesterol it needs. It's capable of doing it. If we take more cholesterol in the diet or some cholesterol in the diet, the body will manufacture less. That regulatory mechanism also exists. However, this regulatory mechanism can be overwhelmed if we take too much of dietary cholesterol. And when this mechanism gets overwhelmed, then this abnormal excess of dietary cholesterol will translate into higher levels of blood cholesterol. So you have to understand that taking just some cholesterol in the diet is not what does us harm. It's taking too much of it, because if we take some of it, the body has a regulatory mechanism for manufacturing less cholesterol for its needs. Further, blood cholesterol has fractions, as everybody knows these days, LDL and HDL, and it is the LDL fraction which is correlated to heart disease. In fact, HDL is the protective fraction. Higher the HDL, the better, and lower the LDL fraction, the better. So our sources of cholesterol in the body are basically two: the diet and the cholesterol that is manufactured in the body, and the two are somewhat reciprocally related. Less we take in the diet, the more the body will have to manufacture for its needs. And the more we take in the diet, the less the body will manufacture. However, this regulation has limits, and therefore we should not overwhelm this mechanism by taking too much of cholesterol. Now, what is too much of cholesterol, or which are the foods which provide too much of cholesterol? You'll get some idea from this table, which shows that meat has considerable amounts of cholesterol, particularly liver and brain. But then who takes brain curry every day? It may have 2000 milligrams per 100 grams, but also shows you that cholesterol is an important constituent of the brain, serves an important function there, and therefore the body does need cholesterol for a proper neural function. And this becomes particularly important for children, because if we keep children away from all the foods which have cholesterol, like say butter or ghee, or egg, the result could be that the child now adapts to a low cholesterol intake, starts using alternatives instead of cholesterol, as we saw in case of fatty acids, and using these alternatives may not lead to the best development of the brain. There is evidence for that. The key molecule which affects this is the DHA molecule. So therefore, it's better to let the child have a more balanced diet, including butter and ghee. And if you want an egg, if you have no moral objection to it, and let the child get accustomed to it, the child will be able to metabolize cholesterol much better. When the child grows up and takes a little extra cholesterol in the diet, the child's regulatory mechanisms will not get easily overwhelmed because the child is adapted to it. And the child therefore will not be oversensitive to cholesterol intake throughout life, and also will have better brain development in childhood. Whole milk, just 40 milligrams per glass. Butter and ghee, 200 milligrams per 100 grams. Higher than meat, but then meat you may take 200 grams. Butter you will not take 100 grams in a day. So that is what we have to keep in mind. So that is why with say 25 grams of butter or even 50 grams of butter, the person will get at the most 50 milligrams of cholesterol. And vegetable oils, 0. Nuts, 0. Now what is that based on? It's based on the fact no plant food contains any cholesterol. It's a blanket statement. People, you see, confuse blood cholesterol with dietary cholesterol. And that's why then they start asking, how about nuts? How about this? How about that? These are all plant products. They do not contain any cholesterol. However, the effect that they will have on blood cholesterol could be different. Some of them may bring down blood cholesterol. Some of them may not. Some of them may affect, may have more N3, may have some more N6. Those are details apart, but they do not have cholesterol. All the fats that we have in plants are triglycerides. There's no cholesterol in plant foods. Still, people keep asking, how about cashew nuts? How about almonds? How about walnuts? How about coconut oil? How about groundnut oil? How about sunflower? These are all plant products. They have no cholesterol. As one nutritionist put it very nicely, cholesterol is manufactured in the liver. Plants do not have a liver, period. How about rice bran oil? Again, no cholesterol. Rice doesn't have a liver. Then I've been saying that, yes, we can take some cholesterol, but not so much as to overwhelm our body mechanism. How much is the permissible amount? Till recently, it was 300 milligrams a day. Now that also has been taken off, maybe with the support of some studies, maybe under the pressure of the egg lobby, which sponsored some of these studies. All that is possible. But all the same, this 300 milligrams per day at least seems to be a safe limit. Whether you want to cross it, that is up to you under the new advice where this has been removed. But the older studies are not all wrong. We show that people vary in their capacity to tolerate cholesterol. There are hyper responders, and that's not a very old study. That study was published in the Journal of Nutrition in 2003. And just because a study is about 20 years old does not make its results invalid, which means there are people who behave differently when it comes to dietary cholesterol. Some people can regulate this manufacturing of cholesterol in the body better than others. And therefore, those who can't do it so well are hyper responders. Hyper, excess, high response, which means that they respond in an exaggerated manner to dietary cholesterol, which means even 300 milligrams may be too much for them. And they may respond even to 300 milligrams per day by having a higher cholesterol level. Now you may say that, well, all that is okay in general, that a lot of people can take up to 300 milligrams a day without overwhelming their regulatory mechanisms in the body, but a few may not be able to tolerate even 300 milligrams. But how about me as an individual? Can I take 300 milligrams per day? The simplest and the surest way is, if you do want to take egg. If you don't want to take egg, then there's no problem. But if you do want to have an egg every day, then the simplest thing to do is stop taking your daily egg for 1 month. And then measure your blood cholesterol levels. Get the blood cholesterol test done. Then take 1 egg religiously every day for the next 1 month, and then get your blood test again done for blood cholesterol. So the level that you had after giving up for egg for 1 month is your basic level without taking egg. And the level that you have after eating one egg every day religiously for 1 month is the level that you have in response to this one egg per day. If the two are quite similar, then you are not a hyper responder. Your body can adjust very well its own manufacturing of cholesterol to this intake of one egg per day. On the other hand, if you get a brisk rise in the blood cholesterol level at the end of this 1 month of one egg per day, then you are a hyper responder, and then for you, even one egg may be too much. And where is the cholesterol in the egg? All cholesterol in the egg is in the yellow part of the egg. The white part doesn't have any cholesterol. Now, this is an important slide, because when people lay too much emphasis on the diet, the type of fat that I take, and whether I take an egg or not, and so on, coming back again to the egg, since we saw that plant products do not have any cholesterol, and much of the Indian diet, even amongst non-vegetarians, is essentially a vegetarian diet, but some of them do take egg quite regularly at breakfast, which means it is basically a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet. Lacto, milk, ovo means egg and vegetarian. So lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet is a common pattern in India. Now, milk will not provide more than 50 milligrams of cholesterol anyway, milk and milk products. One egg will provide 250 milligrams, which means that for such people whose diet is predominantly vegetarian, one egg per day will still keep the daily intake of cholesterol within permissible limits. Okay. That doesn't mean I'm telling that you should take an egg every day, but you can take an egg every day without at least worrying about the cholesterol if your diet is otherwise predominantly vegetarian. But then people worry too much about these things. What they forget is that blood cholesterol levels are affected by many factors. First is our genes, which we can do nothing about. But then there's a lot that we can do about, which can, to quite some extent, overcome and override the effect of our genes. So high blood cholesterol levels tend to run in families. Heart disease also tends to run in families. But genes are what we call the non-modifiable risk factor. And if we take care of all the modifiable risk factors, then we can by and large override the effect of the genes, which means we can delay the expression of these genes. And if you have been able to delay the expression of genes, which increase the risk for high blood cholesterol and heart disease up to the age of 70, 75, the person has essentially got overcome the effect of the genes altogether. How about gene therapy? People say these days gene therapy is also being talked about. Firstly, it is not as simple because these are polygenic in character. These things, high blood cholesterol, heart disease are polygenic in character, which means a large number of genes put together determine this tendency, not a surety that a person will have heart disease. They determine only a tendency and a large number of genes. To modify all those genes is not easy. Secondly, some people have done theoretical calculations. Walter Willett is an important public health person who did that probably for the first time, that what is on the whole better, to go in for gene therapy or to go in for lifestyle changes. And he came to the conclusion that it is more prudent, more economical, and probably more beneficial to work on the lifestyle than to bother about genes and go in for gene therapy. So forget about the genes. Be grateful for what you got from your parents instead of complaining. One of the most important things which affects blood cholesterol is body weight. No matter how the person has put on weight, the person is likely to have high blood cholesterol. And to put on weight, high fat diet is not necessarily the culprit, because if we take more energy than we need, we'll put on weight no matter what the source of that energy was. For example, cows can be fattened on grass, and grass certainly contains no fat. So it's not the fat intake which is the culprit. The culprit is the energy intake being in relation to the energy requirement. And to increase the energy requirement, take some exercise. Then dietary fats and exercise itself brings down blood cholesterol. Dietary fats, especially those having more of saturated fat and trans fat, they increase blood cholesterol levels. Too much of sugar, refined sugar, increases blood cholesterol levels. Cholesterol content of the diet may overwhelm the regulatory mechanisms of the body and may raise blood cholesterol levels. Smoking raises blood cholesterol level. Mental stress raises blood cholesterol levels. Students have been found to have higher cholesterol levels when they are going through examination stress. And chemicals like oranzol in rice bran oil also bring down blood cholesterol. But then you can see when there are so many things that affect blood cholesterol, what difference will this little presence or absence of this little oranzol make? So you have to have that sense of proportion. That is what's important. Now, well, among Indians, it's not blood cholesterol, but blood triglycerides, which are more important. Genetically, we tend to have quickly high triglyceride levels, and these are, again, closely related to heart disease. They are also affected by more or less the same factors. The genes, the body weight, physical activity, blood pressure levels, dietary fat intake, dietary cholesterol intake, dietary sugar intake, alcohol intake, smoking, all these influence blood triglyceride levels. So again, don't concentrate on one thing, look at the lifestyle as a whole. How about aspirin and statins? Aspirins do decrease the tendency of the blood to clot, and therefore they may reduce the possibility of a clot forming in those vessels which go to essential organs like the heart. And it is under this type of an expectation that aspirin, low dose aspirin has been recommended for long periods of time. For years together, some people are advised to take aspirin as a preventive measure against heart disease. But then while it decreases the capacity, the tendency of the blood to clot, it can also create the opposite tendency, that is increase the tendency of the blood to bleed, which means organs to bleed inside. And that is what probably explains that some studies indicate that aspirin might increase the possibility of a stroke. If there's a hemorrhage, cerebral hemorrhage, that will lead to a stroke. So whether the reduction in heart attacks is enough to take that additional risk for a stroke can be debated. But again, as we saw, if there are so many factors which influence blood cholesterol levels and more or less the same factors affect heart disease, it may not be always advisable to take aspirin for long periods of time. And that was essentially what Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya also said a few days back, that if you want to go in for a more comprehensive lifestyle change, do that. But if you think that that's too troublesome and you want to settle down just for one tablet a day, then you can take ecospirin. So the choice is yours. To some extent, something similar applies also to statins. Statins are being used very commonly for bringing down blood cholesterol levels and blood triglyceride levels and so on, lipid-lowering drugs. And their main effect is on cholesterol because they block the synthesis of cholesterol in the body. We have a capacity to manufacture cholesterol. They inhibit that enzyme, a key enzyme which is required for manufacturing cholesterol in the body, and that's how they bring down blood cholesterol levels. Again, they have some very common but minor side effects like headache and indigestion and nausea and so on. But they also have low prevalence, but all the same, they do have some long-term serious side effects like heart disease, not heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, and most common long-term side effect, relatively common, not very common, but relatively common is myositis. That is inflammation in the muscles, which gives rise to muscle weakness and pain. So the patients are particularly warned that if you notice muscle pains and weakness, do consult your doctor before you continue with statins. And once again, whether you go in for these drugs or an overall lifestyle change, this is more convenient, but lifestyle change can be more effective, make these drugs unnecessary, and also with the yogic attitude that lifestyle can be more enjoyable than the lifestyle the patient is accustomed to. And that is why when we go in for a lifestyle modification through a course going on for a longish period of time, that is more likely to be effective because that brings home to the patient the joy of living a healthy lifestyle, because that now fits into an overall philosophy of life. On the other hand, if you tell the person, well, if the choice is yours, either take this drug or you take a diet which doesn't have this, this, and this, which has this, this, and this, and you take half an hour of a walk every day, stop smoking from tomorrow, start sleeping 6 to 8 hours a day from tomorrow, don't sleep less, go to bed early, get up early, do all this. The patient says yes, he goes out, doesn't take him more than a day to go back to the old lifestyle. Taking these drugs is much easier. You have to spend time with the person to realize that the new lifestyle advice was complete. Within 5 minutes, the doctor gave it. But it takes time for the patient who has been accustomed to an unhealthy lifestyle to realize that the healthy lifestyle can be more enjoyable. That is where the importance of longer courses about life modification comes in. So, some important conclusions. Excess calories will lead to weight gain irrespective of the source of calories. So, important thing is to eat less. The energy intake should be reasonable. And again, what is reasonable can vary because the body can adapt to a slightly lower intake than we need and also to a slightly higher intake than we need, keeping the body weight constant. The best choice is eat a little less than you need and let the body adapt to that. But then don't eat less and exercise less so that you can eat very little and still keep the body weight constant. Eat a reasonable amount, which is a little less than you need, but this reasonable amount becomes necessary for you because you're also exercising. Because exercise is not only to maintain body weight, it has many other benefits. So have that type of a balance where you're eating a reasonable amount, are physically active, and do not gain weight and do not overeat. How overeating can be avoided without making any special effort, we'll come to in one of the subsequent sessions because it doesn't require too much effort. If you eat the right type of food, you cannot easily overeat. That is sort of the basic thing. Then overweight is the doorway to high cholesterol and many diseases. So it's the weight that is more important than anything else. And for weight, the energy intake plus exercise, this balance between exercise and calories is what is important for body weight. And overweight is the most important risk factor. So instead of going about the risk indicators found in blood tests, which may be in milligram and nanogram quantities, take care of the indicator, which is staring at us in kilogram quantities. So take care of overweight. Many of these problems will avoid it, including even high blood cholesterol levels. Just losing some weight will bring down blood cholesterol levels also, along with blood sugar. Excess fat of any type raises blood cholesterol level. This is again extremely important because people think saturated fat raises blood cholesterol, unsaturated fat lowers blood cholesterol. Up to a point that is true. But if a person takes too much of even saturated fat, suppose you take 40% of your energy intake in the form of even sunflower oil will raise blood cholesterol instead of bringing it down. So any type of fat raises blood cholesterol if you take too much of it. Unfortunately, all this is not really difficult for Indians because of our traditional diet. Having this type of a balanced diet became difficult in Western countries, It was not always so difficult after the Industrial Revolution because the response of any community or any society to prosperity. Industrial Revolution brought prosperity. The prosperity is to go in for more palatable foods, more prestigious foods. And most of the palatable and prestigious foods tend to be those which are high sugar, high fat, and high in non-vegetarian food. That is what they went for, and that is what has made it difficult for them even to stick to 30% of energy intake coming from fat. Many of their diets have 40 to 50% of the energy intake coming from fat. But in India, to even have a diet which provides only 20% of the energy from fat is not difficult. It's not a hardship at all. So one may repeat here, finally what comes is what we know, excess of everything in bad, which is what this ancient saying in Sanskrit also says, Ati sarvatra varjayet. Excess of everything is prohibited, it is bad. Now we come to some frequently asked questions. What is the secret behind the health promoting effects of Mediterranean diets? Before I reveal the answer to you, many of you might have said that secret is olive oil. But that is not true. Because Mediterranean diet not only has olive oil, it also has legumes, unrefined cereals, fruits, and vegetables. Secondly, they also have a low consumption of non-fish meat products. And fish would mean more of N3 polyunsaturated fat. They eat small portions of food at a time. They don't take heavy meals. They are physically active. And there's a great emphasis a great social value attached to freshness of food, maintaining balance in life, and taking pleasure in food. They try to take food in company of the other members of the family, enjoy the food. Meal time is a happy time. Now, these are all things that we forget. And we say Mediterraneans are so healthy because they take olive oil. That is a myth promoted by perhaps the olive oil lobby. Which are the best nuts to have? Again, the relative value of different nuts may not be as extreme as is sometimes made out to be, although the current consensus is that probably almonds and walnuts, badam and akhrot, they are better than others. But then pista is trying to compete very hard and making a point by saying that it is a skinny nut. Skinny because small in size and probably a little less in caloric content. The skinny nut. So you can have a nut and yet avoid it taking too much of fat. But anyway, all this is basically industrial sort of. One doesn't know how much of it is true, but all the same, almonds and walnuts currently are the most favored ones for blood cholesterol level, otherwise also for prevention of a variety of lifestyle diseases. But again, how much? Not too much. Because too much will mean too many calories and that will defeat the whole purpose. If you have too much of these, don't compensate for it through the other rest of the diet and exercise, one will put on weight, and that is the biggest risk factor. So 5 badams or 2 walnut halves, which is the traditional amount, is good enough per day. How do refined oils differ from unrefined oils? Refined oils are made by heating the oil to very high levels and then extracting it and removing everything from it except oil, so that it is colorless and it has nothing else except the oil, and it has no odor and therefore feels good, and it can also be heated to very high temperatures easily, convenient for cooking. Unrefined oil, on the other hand, made by pressing the seed, and we do get oil. Along with that, we get some other components which may be useful, like carotene in case of palm oil, and some other components in case of other oils which have nutritional value. But at the same time, some of these other components may make it difficult for it to heat to high temperatures. It may also have some odor left. What we should have, what we should not have, not go into too much. Probably that can be left with relief and pleasure to the subsequent sessions which we'll have on Ayurveda. But I've given you some of the key differences between refined oil and unrefined oil. What is the effect of heating on oil? This is important because sometimes the same oil is heated again and again. Say in a pakode ki dukaan or samosa ki dukaan. They don't throw the oil away. Whatever is left over, to that a little more fresh oil is added, and the old oil continues to get heated and reheated again and again. That is bad because that can lead to the formation, conversion, chemical conversions in the oil, which may yield products which can increase the risk for cancer. So at homes, the best policy is whatever is left over after frying once should be added to a vegetable instead of being kept for the next episode of frying. So instead of leaving it for frying once again, just use it up in a vegetable. Now some questions, which are more like self-assessment questions. True or false? A zero cholesterol oil brings the level of blood cholesterol down to 0. Blood cholesterol never comes down to 0, and it is not desirable, it's not healthy, it's probably incompatible with life. What the zero cholesterol means is, that the oil does not have any cholesterol. And this applies not only to the oil being advertised, it applies to all vegetable oils because no plant product has any cholesterol. So this statement, the zero cholesterol oil brings the level of blood cholesterol down to 0, is a false statement. Zero oil cooking is impossible, although desirable, impossible and undesirable, possible and essential, possible but not necessary. It is possible. So impossible part goes. Possible and essential. It is possible, but it is not essential. It is not necessary. So the right option is the last one. Then the worst culprit for overweight is too much dietary fat, too much of dietary carbohydrate, inadequate dietary protein, none of the above. In fact, the worst culprit for overweight is too many calories. So none of the above is the worst culprit. The worst culprit is just taking more calories than we need. So the right response is none of the above. Now here's an assertion reason type of question. All dietary fats are interchangeable, and the reason given here is all dietary fats are interchangeable because all dietary fats provide 9 calories per gram. Yes, all dietary fats do provide 9 calories per gram, but in many other respects they're not alike, and therefore all dietary fats are not interchangeable. It is important to pay attention to which dietary fats we are consuming. So assertion is a false statement. Dietary fats are not interchangeable, although reason is a true statement. A single high-fat meal is totally harmless. The reason given is body weight and overall health depend on fat intake over a long period of time. While by and large the reason given is a true statement, and therefore there may be a tendency to think that a single high-fat meal is totally harmless, and it may be so at least for young people. But after a certain age, this could be the precipitating factor for a heart attack. Because the heart attack can be the result of acute spasm of the coronary arteries superimposed on a partial block. And this spasm or sudden contraction, blocking of the blood supply completely to a part of the heart, can be precipitated by a single high-fat meal, together with exposure to cold, a heated argument, smoking and drinking, and so on. And therefore, imagine a person who has gone in the winters to a party, had a single high-fat meal there, and also smoked and had some alcohol, and he had a heated discussion with somebody, and then he walks out of the hall where the party took place. Outside it's very cold, he gets exposed to cold, gets into the car, and then drives home quite all right, but then the next morning he doesn't get up. And people say, oh, he was hale and hearty, we saw him yesterday evening. What happened? Heart attacks can be so cruel, they can be so sudden and so on. But what happened was that all these things which can precipitate this acute contraction of the coronary arteries came together in his case, and that is why he had this heart attack at night and didn't get up in the morning. So you might say that, well, for that one has to have at least a partial block, but then who doesn't have a partial block? A child is born with completely clean arteries, no fatty deposits at all. But then that is only for the newborn. Even at the age of 5, a child has some small fatty streaks in the arteries, and that is what is considered to be the beginning of atherosclerosis. So anyone above 40 will probably have a little bit of block. And that is also what explains that if anyone above 50 or 60 goes through a coronary angiography, it is very easy to frighten him. See, you have so much block in so many arteries, so better get, if not a bypass, at least an angioplasty. Very easy to frighten him. Most people will have a partial block. Why we can continue in spite of the partial block is because the body has firstly reserve. We don't need all our capacity during our everyday activities. Secondly, there are alternative channels of blood flow which are forming in the heart, which are called collaterals. So these are the two things that are saving the person. But if you look at only the degree of blockage of the coronary arteries, anybody after a certain age will have a partial blockage. And it is this person who, for him, if all these factors which can lead to a sudden contraction of the coronary, if they come together, that can lead to a heart attack. And a single high-fat meal is one of those factors which can lead to this type of a sudden contraction. So the assertion is a false statement. A single high-fat meal can also be harmful. While the reason is a true statement, by and large, yes, once in a while one can get away with some irregularities, and the blood cholesterol levels, body weight, a tendency for diabetes, all those things will be the result of diet over a long period of time, not the result of a single meal. And therefore, a young person can by and large get away with it. He can have his fill at a party, he or she. Take what you like best, including the dessert which you did not really need. Everything you can have and get away with it, but not a person after a certain age. Suggested reading in the same book, Eating Wisely and Well, chapter 4, the title itself is Densely Packed. And this is the place from where I'm speaking, the place where I live and work. And after the lifting of the COVID restrictions, the place is open to guests. So you are most welcome here. And for questions, for which there, again, I have left not much time because the talk was densely packed, you can always drop an email on this address, yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making this event possible, and hope it helped you all in some way or the other. Thank you all for listening.
There's a question. Yes.
Yes, please, I have a question.
Yes.
I live in the Mediterranean Sea, and we're used to cook with olive oil, and we use the olive oil for salads every day. We are using every day in many ways. And we eat fish normally once a week minimum. Do you think this is the best combination with N3, the omega-3 from the fish and the olive oil to have a good lifestyle and wealthy? Thank you.
In fact, what you are saying has some of the elements of the Mediterranean diet, and we saw that has not one but several factors put together which make it a healthy lifestyle. At least two things you pointed out, that along with the olive oil, you also take fish. The second important thing could be a genetic, or rather adaptation over many generations. So if that is the diet you are accustomed to in Spain, which probably is not too far away from the regions in which the Mediterranean diet developed, then okay, because Spain is pretty to the east, near the Mediterranean region.
And if I have to add another kind of fat, what is the best? Is ghee or another kind of like soya oil? What do you recommend to make a balance? Less olive oil, and a little bit more soya oil. What do you recommend?
Probably for balance, soya would be better, because since you are taking a non-vegetarian diet, some saturated fat will anyway come, for which the butter or ghees are not essential. And what soya will do is to provide an additional N3, which may shift the N3-N6 ratio in a better direction. So probably soya may be better as a combination rather than use butter or ghee.
Okay, thank you.
But I mean, the general dictum is that we should continue to eat what our society has been eaten in society for hundreds of years, because the population has got adapted to that. Unless, I mean, one makes a radical change because of a certain conviction, like say suddenly turning vegetarian or vegan and so on. So then one has to do it carefully, seeing that that drastic change does not lead to an unbalanced or unhealthy diet.
There's a question in the chat box. Where do we get N6 if we take only mustard oil and ghee?
Yes, we get some N6 also from mustard oil. Mustard oil is not all N3. It is one of the very few sources of N3, but doesn't mean that doesn't have N6. For N6, we have plenty of sources, but for N3, we have very few. That's why it was emphasized.
Okay, then you said that during stomach upset or episodes of diarrhea, MCT-rich coconut oil is advisable. What about ghee? It has SCFA.
Yes, ghee will not be very easy to digest when a person is recovering from diarrhea. Coconut oil is digested much more easily. That is true. Because you see, in the intestines, we have a lot of reserve for digestion of carbohydrates and proteins. The reserve is the least for fats. And therefore, whenever digestion suffers due to any reason, they'll be maybe recovering from a diarrhea, or it is because of old age. It is the fat absorption which suffers the most. And if one has to take a fat at that stage, coconut oil would be the one which is easiest to digest.
My question is that, is being overweight just an interplay of calories in and expenditure? How about a patient with hypothyroidism where the metabolism is slow? Could you please throw some light in respect to this?
Yes, I mean, I really basically we're not speaking about overweight, but blaming the hormones or blaming genes is sometimes an excuse for overweight. It is also true that one can be reasonably overweight and still physically fit. That is another paradigm that is emerging now, that one can be fat but fit. Fitness is more important than a certain prescribed weight conforming to certain arbitrary standards. That's not absolutely essential. But all the same, the overall concept of energy balance affecting weight remains a basic concept. And one should try as much as possible using that concept to maintain a reasonable weight, but not get obsessed with it. Not everybody will be able to achieve a zero figure, what's called that shape, which sometimes considered the ideal, but that's not the ideal. There's nothing like an ideal figure. Any figure can be satisfactory, provided, I mean, we are conscious of not just sort of taking refuge under some excuse or the other. And if it is hypothyroidism, yes, it does increase the weight, but then that is not the only thing it does. Better to treat that hypothyroidism, and if one treats it with thyroxine tablets, the body weight will also come down. But then one should not take thyroxine pills as a treatment for overweight. That is again important. So they should be taken only after getting the blood test done and under doctor's advice. So thyroxine pills are not to be used as a weight losing treatment for weight loss.
Next is, but soya oil is new. It's a part of our traditional meal. As a part of our traditional meal, we used mustard oil, sesame oil, and peanut oil. So is soya bean oil good?
Good in terms of its chemical composition. And a lot of people have taken to it partly under medical advice because of this chemical composition, and partly because it is a very convenient oil to use for cooking. It has no odor and so on. But all the same, if you want to stick to the traditional oils, mustard oil as much as possible, but then have also where you feel it's necessary or more suitable for cooking other mediums like sesame oil, other oils, you can do that. The body has a lot of resilience, as we saw. Even went to the extremes of the ratio of N6 to N3 being 30:1. It took years for the medical world to discover that it was doing some harm. So there's no obvious harm. So avoid extremely lopsided diets. That is what is essential. You can continue taking what you are accustomed to for several generations.
Many fit people are now experiencing heart attacks. What is the reason for that?
Well, I mean, that is a question that can be summed up very quickly. I can get a very brief answer, or it can get a very long answer. Today, the compulsions demand that one gives a very brief answer. The person was never fit. He didn't know that he was unfit.
I think that will be all. There are no more questions. So we end today's session. And our next session will be on Monday. That will be again a practical session. Tomorrow being Friday, we will have the Yes Talk at 5 p.m. in the evening. You all are welcome to join us. So thank you everyone once again. We end with the music.
And tomorrow's Yes Talk will be by the one who is sitting next to me, whom you do not see much of, Aditi. She'll be speaking on equanimity.
So, all right. Thank you everyone.